The hospital room was dim, the only light coming from the Roman forestand that cast eerie shadows on the white walls. Elvis lay in the bed, his body a map of bruises and cuts, his eyes vacant. Marlon sat in a chair by the window, staring at his friend, feeling helpless and angry. It had been 3 days since he found Elvis beaten and broken in his home, and the images still haunted him. Elvis's face was swollen, his lips split, and his eyes sunken. He hadn't spoken a word since they brought him in. Marlon had tried everything, joking, pleading, even shouting to get a response, but nothing worked. Elvis just stared through everyone, as if he wasn't even there. Marlon's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't he called the police immediately? Could he have stopped the torture? The guilt gnawed at him, making his stomach churn. He knew the police were investigating, but so far, they had found nothing. Sam Katzman, the man behind it all, was still out there, and Marlon felt a deep, burning rage every time he thought of him. As Marlon sat there, a nurse entered the room. She was new, and Marlon hadn't seen her before. She approached Elvis quietly, thinking he was asleep, but Elvis wasn't sleeping. His eyes were fixed on the Roman foredrip, his mind a jumble of pain and fear. Just as the nurse was about to leave, Elvis made his move. He had been planning it for hours, his mind clouded by the drugs and the trauma. He grabbed the Roman foreneedle, his hand shaking, and raised it above his chest. The nurse saw it and screamed, startling Elvis. He dropped the needle, and his eyes flew open. The nurse called for help, and soon the room was filled with doctors and nurses, all trying to calm Elvis down. Marlon watched, his heart pounding, as they restrained his friend and sedated him. Later, when the room was quiet again, Marlon sat back down, his mind reeling. He remembered the day he found Elvis, the way his friend's body had been twisted and battered. He remembered the look of sheer terror in Elvis's eyes, the way he had clung to Marlon, begging for help. Marlon knew he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and let Katzman and his gang get away with this. But what could he do? The police seemed to be going nowhere, and Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was pushing to keep the whole thing quiet. Parker had even formed a citizens committee to take matters into their own hands, but Marlon wasn't sure he trusted Parker's motives. He thought about the conversation he had with Carmen, Elvis's close friend. She had written a letter trying to encourage Elvis, but it had done nothing. Elvis closed his eyes and turned away, just like he had done with Marlon. It was as if he had given up, and Marlon couldn't bear to see his friend like this. Marlon's phone rang. It was Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Vernon was in Tennessee, and he sounded worried. He told Marlon about the incident with the nurse and the Roman foreneedle. Marlon promised to keep an eye on Elvis, but he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The next morning, Marlon visited Elvis again. He read Carmen's letter out loud, hoping it would reach his friend. But Elvis just closed his eyes, and Marlon felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He sat there for a few more minutes, then left the room, his mind full of questions and fears. The hospital team was fighting to save Elvis's kidneys, to clear the blood clots, and to keep him from getting an infection. But Marlon knew the real fight was for Elvis's mind and soul. He had to find a way to bring the people who had done this to justice, but he also had to protect Elvis from the public's scrutiny and judgment. As Marlon walked out of the hospital, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to help Elvis, no matter what it cost him. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but he couldn't give up. Not now, not ever. Marlon had always been a strong, no-nonsense kind of guy, but even he was shaken when Colonel Parker called. Parker was usually all business, but this time he was emotional, almost desperate. Marlon couldn't remember ever hearing Parker like that. He hung up the phone, feeling a rage he hadn't felt since the day Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Without thinking, Marlon got into his car and drove to Sam Katzman's mansion. The front door was unlocked, so he walked right in. Sam was sitting on a sofa, and there was another man with him. Marlon knew this guy. He worked for Katzman and had been part of the group that nearly killed Elvis. Marlon didn't mince words. He told Sam he knew what had happened and that Katzman's gang was responsible. Sam just grinned and denied everything. He stood up and started insulting Elvis, calling him names that Marlon couldn't repeat. Sam then accused Marlon of lying and even tried to proposition him. Marlon had had enough. he punched Sam in the face. Sam's hired thug lunged at Marlon, and they fought for a few minutes. Sam motioned for his man to back off, but Marlon's eye was already black, and the other one was swelling. He hurled some more insults and left. Back home, Marlon wrote a long letter to Carmen, telling her everything that had happened. He was still boiling with anger, and felt like he could tear someone apart. Elvis had asked Marlon to deliver a letter to Carmen, but Marlon didn't want Elvis to see him beaten up, so he told Carmen the letter might be late. Thinking about what Elvis had gone through made Marlon's heart ache. He remembered how hard it was for Elvis to stand up after the beating. Elvis had kept the worst details secret, even when he was in the hospital close to death. Marlon knew how much emotional pain Elvis was in, and he felt a deep sense of responsibility to protect him. The next morning, Marlon got a chilling phone call from Marcus. Marcus threatened to kill Elvis if Marlon didn't keep quiet. He said it would be slow and painful, and Marlon wouldn't know when or where it would happen. Marcus bragged about almost killing Elvis in his own home, but his brother had stopped him. Marlon's anger was growing, and he wanted to do everything possible to make sure Marcus and the others were punished. He wrote to Carmen that he knew there would be other vengeance. He was determined. They can't be allowed to get away with it, they just can't. Elvis finally came home, but the house brought back nightmarish memories. He asked Marlon to stay with him and his cousin Jean for a few days. Elvis was restless and seemed haunted. He tried to write a letter to Carmen, but couldn't focus. He had lost a lot of weight and was having trouble sleeping. Marlon and Jean tried to get him to eat, but he couldn't, so they suggested he go to bed. Later, Marlon checked on Elvis and found him standing in front of the kitchen sink, staring at a drawer full of steak knives. Marlon knew about the needle incident in the hospital, and quickly spoke up to stop Elvis from doing anything foolish. Elvis turned and said he wasn't doing anything, but his defense betrayed his guilt. Marlon helped him back to the bedroom, but Elvis was shaking and couldn't speak. Marlon thought the house was too much for Elvis and asked if he wanted to go to Marlon's place, but Elvis said he was on his own now. Marlon stayed at his own home but checked on Elvis regularly. One evening, he went to the Hillcrest house to watch TV with Elvis and stay overnight. Marlon had a funny dream about chasing mice with Carmen. The dream ended when he heard a scream. He rushed to Elvis's room and found him sitting up, convinced he had seen a figure in black trying to put a noose around his neck. Marlon calmed Elvis down and stayed up the rest of the night, watching over him. Elvis had a few weeks off after the abduction, which helped. He went back to Memphis with Priscilla and Lisa Marie, escaping to the movies almost every night. When he returned to Los Angeles, he tried to act normal, but Marlon could see the deep sadness in his eyes. Elvis was disturbed and trying to hide his distress. A new movie project called The Trouble with Girls was on the horizon. Elvis didn't want to do it, but he knew he had to, or he'd be sued. Parker tried to make MGM angry with Elvis so they would pay him off, but Marlon believed that abandoning the job would be the worst thing Elvis could do. Marlon went to church and prayed for guidance. He came out determined to be both a brother and a father to Elvis, and asked Carmen to be a sister and a mother. Elvis started pre-production on the movie, but he was struggling. The opening of his film Live a Little, Love a Little was a disaster, and the bad reviews made Elvis despondent. He shared his deep despair with Carmen, feeling like he was under anesthesia and unable to function. He was depressed and found it hard to connect with himself. He felt that no one understood how raw and confused he was. Parker told Elvis he'd feel better if he got some girls and had some fun, but Marlon encouraged him to talk to God. Elvis felt too undeserving and estranged from God to do that. He was worried he was psychologically damaged and wondered if the brutal acts of sodomy were a response to unconscious signals he was sending out. He needed something powerful to erase those memories. Elvis labored on with the movie, but once he walked out on the director, something he had never done before. Marlon saw the movie when it came out and said it was easy to see what Elvis was going through by looking at his face on the screen. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were pained, and his mouth was tightly drawn. Marlon felt like they were back to those days when they kept a constant vigil over Elvis. After the movie, Elvis found Gigi and Priscilla together in his guest house. He threw Gigi out, a final blow to his sense of masculinity. He felt increasingly desperate and needed someone to show him the way. He apologized to Carmen for burdening her with his problems, but couldn't keep his feelings inside any longer. In January 1969, Elvis attempted suicide again. No one ever described what happened, but the attempt was referenced in letters. Elvis apologized to Carmen, saying not to worry about him, but then he planted more concern by declaring, "What is in me nobody else can help." He felt empty and fatalistic, just coasting along doing whatever he was told. Elvis had also attempted suicide in 1967. He mentioned it to Carmen a couple of months later, saying he felt she was sent to save his soul. He remembered a night in the lonely desert in November 1967 when he might have been lost forever without her. Suicide was never far from Elvis's mind. Joe Esposito, Elvis's friend and road manager, found a suicide note next to Elvis's body the day he died, but he burned it to protect Elvis's family. In 2018, a just-discovered suicide note from January 1977 revealed Elvis's deep despair. "I need a long rest. I'm sick and tired of my life." His stepbrother called it a clear sign that suicide was on his mind. The night of Elvis's 1967 suicide attempt, he felt like he was out of his mind. After just 6 months of marriage, he had fallen into a deep depression and was in a trance-like state where he felt like he had no reason left. Carmen, his wife, somehow intervened and saved him. Later, Elvis asked a minister if God would forgive him if he had died, and the minister said God always forgives if you ask. Elvis always wondered if the 1968 abduction and torture he suffered were a punishment for his suicide attempt. He tried again in January 1969, and maybe the thought of God's forgiveness made it easier for him to try. On March 13, 1969, Elvis finally told Carmen about the hot poker. He had told her some of what the gang did to him, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her about the gang rape and the poker. The reason he wrote the letter was that Marcus, the man who had tortured him, was found dead in a canyon near Culver City. Marcus had been beaten with his skull crushed. Elvis was worried that he might be suspected of getting revenge, but he told Carmen he could never do such a thing because he hated violence. He believed whoever killed Marcus was just as doomed as Marcus was for his cruelty. Elvis remembered the searing pain of the poker, and how he wanted to tear Marcus apart. He reminded Carmen that he could kill a man with one karate blow, and he felt justified. He still wanted revenge, so he hoped he would never be alone with any of his assailants. Marlon, Elvis's friend, revealed more about Marcus's murder. In Marcus's wallet, the police found an envelope with hair clippings. Marlon was sure the hair was Elvis's, a souvenir from the night of the torture. Marlon feared that if the police found out the hair was Elvis's, they might think Elvis had killed Marcus out of revenge. Elvis was glad he hadn't told Marlon about the poker. If he had, he would have worried that Marlon might have been responsible for Marcus's death. Elvis had only told one person about the poker, and that was Colonel Parker, his manager. Parker later told Marlon about it. Some people think Parker might have been involved in Marcus's death. Author Alana Nash wrote a book suggesting that Parker, born Andreas van Kuijk in Holland, might have murdered a woman in his hometown before coming to America. Nash builds a case that Parker could be capable of murder, but it's hard to imagine Parker hurting Elvis, his main source of income. A few months after Marcus's death, Tom Jones and his manager, Gordon Mills, were kidnapped. They were in Las Vegas and had just left Caesar's Palace when two men followed them and forced them into their rental car. The gang took them to an abandoned mine in the desert and tied them up. The men were high on drugs and stripped Tom and Gordon. They tried to force Tom to swallow a liquid, and when he resisted, one of them cut him with a knife. Tom fell into a pit, and the gang turned on Gordon, who they beat and raped. Tom managed to free himself and pulled Gordon out of the pit. They limped to a road and flagged down a highway patrol car. Gordon was in the hospital for a few days, and Tom had nightmares. The next attack happened at a surprise party for Elvis, before he left for a concert series in Las Vegas. About 50 people were there, and Elvis and Tom Jones were performing. Tom was joking around when he suddenly lowered his head and said he had been shot. No one heard a gunshot, but the bullet had hit his leg. The police and a doctor arrived, and Tom was lucky the bullet didn't hit any major arteries. The police found the bullet lodged in the patio floor and thought it might have been a crackpot who couldn't crash the party. Elvis was upset, but Tom was determined to go to Las Vegas with him. In a letter to Carmen, Tom said he was okay, and that the shooting had made him more committed to the trip. During the summer of 1969, a Satanist cult in Los Angeles was murdering people, and everyone was on edge. Tom Jones wrote more letters about a knife he had. He had thrown it away while traveling between the US and the UK, because he was afraid of what might happen if it was found. He was worried about being convicted of a violent crime based on circumstantial evidence. He got chills at night thinking about it. Later, Tom wrote that a man's body was found buried in the Nevada desert. Tom and Gordon had been tortured in that area, and Tom was terrified. He didn't want to bring the knife to his home in London, where his wife might find it. He was relieved he had gotten rid of it. The knife and the body were connected to the kidnapping, and Tom was scared of what might happen if the truth came out. Tom's nerves were frayed when he heard the news about the man who had died from a knife wound in the chest. He quickly wrote to Carmen, his close friend, to share his fears. In his letter, Tom mentioned that the victim was described as being older, but he didn't say older than whom. It seemed Tom was trying to piece together a puzzle, and the incomplete thought suggested he was worried about connecting the dots to someone he knew. Tom wrote, "It may not be the same man, but I've been shaking in my boots ever since I heard. Elvis is jittery, yet there can't be anything to tie us in. There can't be, yet I feel very uneasy. Please destroy this letter before you leave." Carmen, thankfully, didn't destroy it, and it revealed Tom's deep anxiety. Tom's reference to something that can't tie us in hinted at a shared secret, possibly involving a knife that only he and Davy Jones knew about. The letter suggested a connection between the knife, the abduction of Tom Jones and Gordon Mills, and the body found in the desert. Meanwhile, Elvis's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Marlon, his friend, noticed this and became concerned. In late September, Elvis started worrying that someone might be poisoning his food. Marlon convinced Elvis to save samples of his meals, and he personally delivered them to a chemist for testing. The results were alarming. The chemist found enough acid in a bottle of sucralose sweetener to kill several people. Marlon suspected Colonel Parker, who had recommended Elvis use the sucralose for weight control. Fortunately, Elvis rarely used the sweetener, which might have saved his life. The year 1969 brought more violence and threats. In early October, Tom was leaving a recording studio when a blonde girl approached him with a bouquet of flowers. Just as Tom was about to accept the flowers, she dropped them and lunged at him with a straight razor. A photographer and a fan quickly intervened, and the police arrived to arrest the girl. Tom later discovered that she was connected to Charles Manson and his followers, who had plans to murder various celebrities, including Tom. The violence continued in Las Vegas, where Elvis, Tom, and the Supremes were out together when they were confronted by three men. Mary Wilson, one of the Supremes, was slashed down the stomach and under the bust, similar to the injuries suffered by Sharon Tate, a victim of the Manson gang. Tom was deeply disturbed by the attack and struggled to connect it to his own recent kidnapping. A few days later, Tom was nearly shot as he was getting into a limousine. The bullet narrowly missed him, and Tom wondered if it was meant for Gordon Mills, his manager. The police determined that the shot was likely aimed at Tom's abdomen, but it missed. Tom took it as a reminder that he was not safe anywhere. The tension escalated again on December 2nd, 1969, when Cindy Birdsong, a member of the Supremes, was abducted from her apartment. She managed to escape with minor injuries, and the abductor, Charles Edward Collier, a custodian at her building, was later arrested. Elvis and Tom were relieved that Collier had no connection to the Katzman gang, but the incident only added to their fears. Elvis's year had been filled with personal struggles, including an attempted suicide and chronic eye problems. In March 1970, he checked into a hospital for treatment and was diagnosed with glaucoma. The news was devastating, and Elvis cried for hours. Shortly after his discharge, he received a letter that brought back painful memories and promised more suffering. Instead of giving in to despair, Elvis decided to change his life. He wrote to Carmen about his new goal, to become an evangelist and use his fame to spread God's message. He believed that helping even one person know God better would make it all worth it. Elvis's letter to Carmen revealed his growing faith, and his determination to move past the darkness. However, the new threatening letter plunged him into depression. Despite his uplifting decision, Elvis remained deeply troubled, sleeping for long hours and feeling as though he was losing his sight. His letter to Carmen ended with a plea for her support and a promise to keep trying, even when the road ahead seemed bleak. The summer of 1970 was a time of intense pressure for Elvis. After several months of stressful trials and rehearsals, he was set to perform another series of concerts at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, starting on August 10th. Elvis was determined to make these shows better than ever, but the weight of his fears and the presence of a film crew documenting everything added to his anxiety. On Friday, July 17th, Elvis and Priscilla flew to their home in Palm Springs to relax. Priscilla was pregnant, a fact that only a few people knew. Elvis tried to unwind, but he couldn't shake a sense of unease. He went to bed around 1:30 a.m., but a few hours later, he woke up, feeling disturbed by an unknown presence. In the dim light of the bedroom, Elvis tried to go back to sleep, but then he felt a cold, hard object pressing into his mouth. His eyes snapped open, and he saw a gun barrel jammed down his throat. Two men, both familiar faces from a past nightmare, stood over him. They had been part of a group that had kidnapped and tortured him in 1968. The men were brutal, and they threatened to hurt Priscilla and their unborn child if Elvis resisted. The intruders forced Elvis to lie face down on top of Priscilla, who was terrified. They violated him, causing immense pain and humiliation. The gunman then pointed the pistol at Elvis's head, playing a twisted game of Russian roulette. The gun clicked twice, but it was empty. Enraged, Elvis lunged at the men, but they struck him with the gun, and he heard Priscilla's screams. Elvis managed to get dressed and carry Priscilla to the car. She was unconscious by the time they reached the hospital. The baby's life was in danger, and Priscilla was in a state of shock. Amazingly, she did not miscarry immediately, but she went through false labor and was eventually taken to Graceland. Elvis was in deep pain, both physically and emotionally. He had always been a private person, and the idea of explaining what had happened to anyone was overwhelming. He tried to focus on the concerts, but the trauma lingered. 3 weeks after the Palm Springs ordeal, Elvis started his concert series in Las Vegas. The shows were a welcome distraction, but the stress didn't let up. A waitress named Patricia Ann Parker filed a paternity suit, claiming Elvis was the father of her son. This news was a painful reminder of his past indiscretions and the potential for more scandal. Just 2 weeks later, the International Hotel received anonymous calls warning of a plot to kidnap and assassinate Elvis. The security team went into high alert. Elvis was given a pistol to carry, and his close friends and security detail were armed and positioned around the venue. The show went on, but everyone was on edge. When someone in the balcony called out to Elvis, it was a tense moment, but it turned out to be a request for a song. Despite the threats, the concerts continued without incident. The FBI later declared the calls a hoax, but Elvis remained wary. He knew that the dangers he faced were far from over. In November, Elvis discovered that his tooth powder had been tampered with. It made him feel lightheaded and unwell. He suspected that someone was trying to harm him, but he couldn't prove it. Each time he got a new can, it would be fine for a while, but then it would go bad again. The dentist was puzzled, as no other patient reported similar issues. Elvis's life was a constant battle against unseen enemies. The pressures of fame, the threats to his safety, and the personal traumas he endured were taking a toll. But he kept going, driven by his love for music and his determination to protect those he cared about. Elvis's world was a mix of fame, mystery, and deep spiritual beliefs. In November, he faced a strange and troubling issue. He returned a tooth powder, upset and scared. Elvis thought the tooth powder was making him shake uncontrollably and causing him to feel ill. He couldn't sleep, and his doctor wouldn't give him sleeping pills because of his past problems with barbiturates. The dentist sent the tooth powder to a lab. The results were shocking. 1/3 of the tooth powder had been replaced with cocaine. This made it clear that someone was trying to harm Elvis. The lab results showed that Elvis had become hooked on the cocaine and was probably going through withdrawal. This was a serious betrayal that could have ruined his career. An out-of-control cocaine addiction would have made it impossible for Elvis to perform in concerts or finish movies, which would have damaged his reputation. The person behind this could have called the police to bust Elvis for having cocaine, leading to serious legal problems. However, the drugging went on for months, which suggests that the goal was to make Elvis miserable or to control him, rather than to ruin his career. This rules out Colonel Parker, who would have needed a healthy and successful Elvis for his business. Instead, it was likely someone with a grudge who worked for Elvis, or someone in the household who was working for an enemy with a vendetta. Elvis's letters to the spiritualist Carmen Montes are full of stories about paranormal and supernatural activities. These stories show that Elvis and his friends, like Harry Belafonte, Marlon Brando, and Tom Jones, believed deeply in the spiritual and paranormal world. These beliefs influenced their lives and how they understood the strange events happening around them. Elvis moved from Tupelo, Mississippi, where he was raised in a strict Christian environment, to Memphis, a city with a rich history of voodoo and African witchcraft. This background could have made Elvis more open to the idea of dark magic, or being influenced by it. Elvis had a twin brother, Jesse, who was stillborn. Elvis felt intense guilt for surviving, and believed his brother was his guardian angel. He even moved his brother's grave to Graceland, and created a private cemetery for him and his mother. Marlon Brando, in a letter to Carmen, mentioned that Elvis had been through a lot in the past year, and that his stubbornness and a guardian angel had saved him. Marlon himself believed in the afterlife and practiced spirit writing, where he claimed to channel the spirits of people like Jenny, Elvis's deceased girlfriend. Marlon also had a psychic ability called clairsentiency, which allowed him to detect scents that carried messages from the spirit world. Harry Belafonte was raised in Jamaica, where he was immersed in the world of voodoo. He used his knowledge of voodoo to try to confront a woman he believed was corrupting his half-brother. Harry also sought help from Carmen, giving her the address and phone number of the woman he called a witch. Tom Jones, while not showing much interest in the paranormal, described a frightening experience in a letter to Carmen. After a serious car accident, Tom was in the hospital when he felt a needle going into his arm and a nurse trying to harm him. He saw a green, luminous shape that scared the nurse away. Marlon believed this shape was the spirit of Jenny, watching over Tom. These stories show that Elvis and his friends were deeply affected by what they believed to be paranormal events. They weren't skeptical of these experiences and could describe them openly to someone like Carmen Montes, who shared their beliefs. Their experiences with the paranormal were a significant part of their lives and influenced their actions and beliefs. One expert, Adrian Lee, a paranormal researcher, suggested that Elvis was an empath. Empaths are people who can sense and feel the emotions of others, even if they are far away. This ability can be overwhelming, especially in crowded places. Elvis's fear of crowds and his ability to know when Priscilla was with his aide, Gigi, fit the description of an empath. Empaths can also suffer from physical ailments like digestive problems and back pain, which Elvis experienced. They might use food, drugs, or other addictions to protect themselves from the negative energies of others. Elvis's empathy and spiritual beliefs played a big role in his life. His experiences with the paranormal and his deep connections to the spiritual world were not just strange stories, but real parts of who he was. Understanding these aspects of Elvis's life helps to paint a more complete picture of the man behind the legend. Elvis's letter to Carmen, dated August 25, 1968, revealed a side of him that was deeply troubled. He wrote about how the musical coordinator told him he looked sleepy and mechanical, with tired eyes. He remembered feeling so exhausted that he didn't know how to stand up or hold his head up. This letter was a glimpse into the emotional and physical toll Elvis was experiencing. Adrian, a friend who understood Elvis's complex nature, explained that empaths are often very creative people. They sing, dance, act, draw, or write. They have vivid imaginations and a strong desire to make others happy. In a letter from October 1968, Marlon Brando described Elvis as someone who could instantly bring life and vitality to any room. He wrote, "The funny thing about Elvis is, as unhappy as he himself may be, he has a way of making others feel like their lives were standing still before he arrived on the scene. People begin having fun and acting alive when Elvis is around, whether on the set, at a party, or just at home. He brings a certain energy that lights up the whole environment, and it's contagious. Adrian added that empaths are also very curious about the supernatural and paranormal. They don't get shocked easily, but they get frustrated when their questions go unanswered. This drives them to seek explanations, sometimes leading to information overload. When they feel overwhelmed, they can appear moody, shy, aloof, or even miserable. Elvis certainly fit this description, and Adrian believed he was a classic empath. Elvis's letters and the stories of his friends often mentioned his connection to Native American culture and spirituality. His great-great-great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee, and Elvis often referred to his Indian sixth sense and his uncanny intuition. He would say, "An Indian knows these things," and he asked Carmen to help him explore his Native American heritage psychically. Adrian pointed out that Native Americans recognize empaths with the term Hevoka. A Hevoka is not only an empath, but also a mirror and a teacher. They use extreme behaviors to reflect others' doubts, fears, and weaknesses, forcing them to confront these issues. Hevokas are known for their ability to heal emotional pain, often by sharing their own experiences of shame. They sing about their struggles and act like clowns, bringing laughter to difficult situations and causing fear or chaos when people are too complacent. Hevokas play a crucial role in shaping tribal codes. They are free to violate cultural taboos and critique established customs, helping to define the boundaries of ethical and moral behavior. They are among the few who can question sensitive topics and use satire to challenge those in power, including the guardians of sacred knowledge. When people are open to the Hevoka's healing energy, they feel peaceful, relaxed, and loved. Adrian suggested this might explain why empathic and psychically sensitive individuals like Marlon, Harry, and Carmen were drawn to Elvis and formed meaningful relationships with him. Hevokas, like Elvis, are unpredictable and unconventional. They don't follow society's expectations, rules, or cultural norms. Elvis was a prime example. He invited a 14-year-old fiancée to live in his home, defied societal norms with his provocative performances, and broke industry rules while setting sales records. He also appropriated black music during a time of intense racial tension, and his passionate influence on young people alarmed religious leaders. Adrian believed that Elvis's empathic nature made him more vulnerable to dark magic. Whether these entities were real or not, Elvis believed in the power of spirits and ill intent. He was highly suggestible, as evidenced by his confession to Carmen about being hypnotized by a blackmailer. Adrian speculated that Elvis might have been targeted by a suicide or death demon, a dark entity sent through black magic. Marlon's letter from August 1968 described a night when Elvis screamed in his sleep, claiming he saw a figure in black trying to put a rope around his neck. Marlon had been feeling a strange, unexplained fear for Elvis's safety. Adrian also mentioned a letter where Marlon found Elvis staring at an open drawer of knives, and another where Elvis admitted to attempting suicide 3 times. Adrian explained that dark magic could cause Elvis to act out of character, see entities attacking him, experience physical pain and emotional struggles, and sometimes lapse into a trance-like state. Marlon's letters included accounts of Elvis's face twisting in pain, his eyes fixed on a Roman IV drip as if hypnotized, and his sudden, defensive reactions to being touched in the hospital. When asked who might have been using dark magic against Elvis, Adrian suggested Sam Katzman, a film producer whose parents were from Russia. Katzman was known for his feud with Elvis, and Adrian believed he might have turned to dark magic. Katzman's films often featured themes of voodoo, witchcraft, and dark rituals. Adrian pointed out eerie parallels between the plot of Charo, the movie Elvis had just completed before his abduction, and the actual events of the kidnapping and torture. Adrian had studied Katzman's films and found more links to dark magic. In Voodoo Man, a villain captured young women and transferred their life essences to his dead wife. In The Corpse Vanishes, a victim was taken to an isolated mansion, and their glandular fluid was extracted to rejuvenate the villain's aged wife. Jungle Jim featured a vial of potion that could be deadly, and Fury of the Congo depicted a drug extracted from a mythical creature. Voodoo Tiger showed sacrificial voodoo rituals, and Devil Goddess portrayed a tribe that sacrificed humans to a fire demon. Serpent of the Nile ended with Cleopatra using a poisonous snake to commit suicide, Adrian drew connections between snakes and Elvis. He explained that in magic, serpents symbolize the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, represents this cycle. Snakes and babies are often linked in ritual magic, and killing a snake is believed to cause the death of a child. Adrian theorized that the rattlesnake placed in Elvis's trailer during the filming of Charo might have been intended to make Elvis kill the snake, which would then cause the death of his daughter, Lisa Marie, or an unborn child. Adrian also mentioned the tradition of using a snake, with the victim's hair tied around it to cause illness and death. He suggested that if the rattlesnake in Elvis's trailer had been examined, it might have had someone's hair tied around it. Adrian believed that Katzman's gang used dark magic during the abduction and torture of Elvis. One of the most bizarre acts was forcing Elvis to cut off his beard from Charo. This, Adrian explained, was part of a goofer ritual, where hair is removed to curse the victim. The gang also made Elvis drink a mysterious liquid, which in hoodoo magic could be goofer dust mixed into a drink to cause pain and illness. Adrian's theory about the full moon added another layer to the story. In dark magic, a full moon amplifies negative energies, making spells more effective. The patience Katzman's gang showed in waiting months before retaliating against Elvis suggested a deeper, more calculated plan. Elvis's experiences, as described in the letters and stories, painted a picture of a man deeply affected by his empathic nature and the dark forces that seemed to be targeting him. Whether these forces were real or the product of his imagination, the impact on Elvis was clear. His letters and the accounts of his friends revealed a man struggling with the weight of his gifts and the shadows that followed him. Elvis's letters to Carmen slowed down as the years went on. By 1971 and 1972, they had almost stopped. Maybe they still wrote to each other, but the letters got lost or destroyed. Or maybe, as often happens, the friendship just faded away over time. Each of them had their own life to live, and their own battles to fight. Elvis's life, though, was still full of strange and scary events. In early 1971, he told Carmen that for a while things had been quiet. The Colonel was gone, and he wasn't performing or recording, so he felt safe, but he had a feeling that the danger wasn't over. He sensed that the Katzman gang was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. He felt like he was living on borrowed time. On the anniversary of the attack, Elvis wrote to Carmen again. He had a sudden realization that the gang wasn't just trying to get revenge. They were trying to drive him crazy with fear, shame, and pain. He felt a deep hatred for them, calling them animals. He asked Carmen to pray for him because he needed help. Elvis kept going, but the threats didn't stop. In mid-1972, he had a dream that Carmen came to him in the desert, warning him that his car needed a checkup. The next day, a mechanic found a time bomb in the car set to go off at 6:40 p.m., just before Elvis was supposed to leave for a radio interview. He realized that someone wanted him dead. After that, he decided to take taxis around Las Vegas. One of the most bizarre things that happened involved an impersonator. Not the kind who sings and dances on stage, but a real-life double who looked just like Elvis. This double had even fooled Priscilla. Elvis wrote to Carmen, wondering if it was wrong not to tell Priscilla about the double. He knew something was off, and he was worried about the child Priscilla was carrying. Marlon Brando heard about the double too. His wife, Tarita, saw a man who looked exactly like Elvis on a TV show. Marlon found out the man's name was Ronnie Bissett, and he was a model and musician. Marlon was worried that Bissett was trying to ruin Elvis's reputation, and maybe even his life. Things got even more complicated when Elvis met karate champion Mike Stone. He introduced Stone to Priscilla, and they started a relationship. This led to their divorce and a custody battle over their daughter, Lisa Marie. The Elvis letters to Carmen stopped in early 1973, but the threats didn't. On February 18, 1973, 4 men tried to attack Elvis on stage in Las Vegas. His team, including his bodyguards and band members, quickly stopped them. Elvis was so angry that he wanted to break one of the men's necks. After the show, he became convinced that these men were hired by Mike Stone to kill him. He even asked his bodyguard, Sonny West, to arrange a hit on Stone. Sonny tried to calm him down, and a doctor gave Elvis sedatives, but it took a while for him to relax. In the end, Elvis decided not to go through with it. Elvis's life was a constant struggle, and the memories of the past haunted him. He never fully escaped the darkness that had pursued him for years. But despite everything, he kept performing, kept fighting, and kept trying to find a way to live his life. Even when it seemed like the battles were too much, he didn't give up. He was Elvis Presley, and he faced his demons until the very end.